Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we discuss international relations. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we will be talking about the illusion of hegemony in relations to power, middle states, and US foreign policy. My guest is Dr. Christopher Mott. Hello?
Hello.
Dr. Mott is a Washington Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and also an international relations scholar specializing in geopolitics, strategy, and the intersection of defense realism and sovereignty. He has published a book, The Formless Empire, a short history of diplomacy and warfare in Central Asia. Moreover, Chris runs our own blog, The Trickster's Guide to Geopolitics, which is, quote, a blog about taking an outsider perspective towards issues related to geopolitical strategy. So that's a very interesting profile that Chris has developed through his studies and professional experience. I divided this interview into three parts. The first part will be about the power structures and hegemony. The second part will be about the middle states, about the US foreign policy, and we also will touch a little bit international relations theory and some interesting perspectives at the end. So, Chris, let's start with the first question. And I would like to know, what does hegemony mean to you? What is hegemony in your perspective? That's the first question. And the second question, how do you see the development of hegemony or hegemonic thoughts in international relations? And I think this is a good introduction to get familiar with your perspective and how you understand this topic.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So hegemony is basically when one particular clique, group, state, organization has a disproportionate amount of power over others in a given system. Now, no system is entirely closed, of course, but it's a certain area usually is how it manifests, right? So an example of hegemony that everyone is familiar with would be like the height of the Roman Empire for the Mediterranean basin. Going a bit bigger scale might be the Mongol Empire in Eurasia. These were things that dominated a large group of other societies that were not ones that they themselves arose from. So it is effectively an imbalance in political power on the international scale. Global hegemony is, however, a very, very new thing. So both of those examples I mentioned, as well as others you could throw in, like the early Spanish Empire, etc., they didn't quite get the whole world, right? There was no state that could compete with the Mongol Empire at its height, but at the same time, it didn't really exist in Africa, certainly not in the New World, and really, really struggled to go over bodies of water, famously. The Roman Empire dominated what it saw as most of the world, but even then arguably was not the most powerful state in the world because it shared the stage with Han Dynasty China, which was more technologically advanced and probably had an almost as large population. So, and it even had a peer rivalry with first the Parthians and then the Sasanians in Iran. So these things are relational. They're not like Platonic ideals. We're talking about very kind of specific definitions that change over the course of time and space. But the idea of a kind of global hegemony, which is what oftentimes is used when we in the modern day talk about international relations, that kind of begins with the British Empire. I would strongly dispute anyone that claims that the British Empire had hegemony over the earth, but it was like a really good try, if you will, right? They had one quarter of the planet was under their colonial control. They were the first country to industrialize. The one thing that really thwarted this, though, was this was at the height of the European expansion when Europe was proportionally much stronger, Western Europe specifically much stronger than most of the rest of the world. And so most of their peer rivals were near to them in Europe. So they couldn't quite clear their immediate field. They could just be hegemonic in places like South Asia, Eastern Africa, etc. Uh, then you finally see what we would call a global hegemony emerge with the end of World War II, and the U.S. kind of takes over from the decolonizing British and French empires, also gains influence over its two previous main rivals, which would be Germany and Japan, and then is kind of facing down the Soviet Union, which is a counter near peer state, but is so heavily damaged by the war that it is definitely not an equal peer, right? It is kind of similar to that Rome versus Parthia connection, where they're very strong rivals that can't quite defeat each other, but they're not quite equal. This is what we often talk about when modern day people talk about hegemony. They're talking about there's a world system now, and the United States has been the first country to really have this kind of global level of influence. And obviously, once again, situationally speaking, it's not true everywhere. The US has very little influence on, shall we say, the domestic policies of certain countries like North Korea, though obviously huge influence on North Korean foreign policy. And it's not the same amount of influence everywhere. But from roughly the late 1980s, early 1990s until, well, maybe the Great Recession or so, maybe more recently, depends on who you ask. This is always a topic for debate. But for about 20 years, for the first time ever, there was one state that really had what we could call a global hegemonic influence. And this era is clearly over now. So it's, though the extent to which it's over and the rapidity in which it ended, and even when exactly it ended is up for debate. But I think most people acknowledge now that it's not the 1990s, it's not the 2000s anymore, that fundamentally things are different. And this is effectively the study of the decline of a world hegemonic order. So I guess to really put it most succinctly, hegemony is when there is an order dominated by one particular group. It is lost when that group no longer can dominate to the same extent. And in modern times, we're often talking about the world when we use the term, rather than a specific region. And so I would contend there is no global hegemony anymore. However, this does not mean that there aren't regional hegemonies. But the key point, of course, with that is that you use the plural. Regional hegemony is it's not one thing. There are many different.
You argue that the era of hegemony is over. Is this a global phenomenon, or are certain regions, such as East Asia, still susceptible to hegemonic ambitions due to their, let's say, economic or strategic configurations?
Yeah, I would say that I think recently you might be responding to a something that I published on the IPD website about the Middle East lacking a proper hegemonic structure, something I initially talked about a couple months ago in Armenia. Um, yeah, I think each region has to be taken differently. The argument I use that there is no hegemonic power in the Middle East applies to the Middle East. It may not apply everywhere. I don't think anyone would dispute that the United States is the hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere. I think that's particularly would be hard to dispute that. I don't think I think you can debate the degree to which China is the hegemonic power in East Asia. I'm actually a little bit more skeptical on that than some people are, but the potential is certainly there, absolutely. Um, if you count South Asia as a specific region, some people do, some people don't, then India is clearly a hegemonic power there. And yeah, I mean, but Europe doesn't really have a hegemonic power unless you mean Western Europe and the United States, which means it kind of comes from outside. Um, these things can be complicated, though. East Asia is actually the most interesting to look at because I would say, China is a peer competitor to the United States now. It's not a near peer like the Soviet Union one. I would say it is a peer for its reasons of its industrial capacity, and its internal cohesion is much stronger than the Soviet Union. Um, but nevertheless, the thing that China has that the Soviet Union didn't necessarily have, with its near abroad, often its focus being Central Asia and Eastern Europe, is that there weren't super strong states in its immediate near abroad. And this is what makes it slightly more different in the Chinese example. Like the US has kind of, in astronomy, when they decided to demote Pluto from being a planet, one of the reasons that they used was that it failed to clear its field, was the term, right? It was not the undisputed center of gravity. Like the orbital space between Pluto and Charon, its moon, is like outside of Pluto. And so they use this as one of the definitions for classifying as something else. I would say a similar thing kind of applies to world powers. You have to clear your field to have a really secure position. And the United States has cleared its field because with the U.S.-Mexico War in the 1840s, because they were kind of peer competitors before that, and then they were, and there is no peer competitor in the Western Hemisphere. Maybe one day Brazil could be, but certainly not like Canada or Mexico, right? China is clearly the strongest state in Asia. It's either tied for or is the second strongest state in the world. But this doesn't change the fact that it's really, really close to Japan, which is economically speaking the third strongest state in the world, and still has retained more of its industrial base than many other developed countries has. Um, Certain countries that are far less strong than China are still much more robust national entities than small countries in other parts of the world might be, like Vietnam, for instance. And then, of course, China borders Russia quite significantly, which is still a world power, albeit the clear weakest of the top three. So, it's complicated. Like, is there the potential for a Chinese hegemony in East Asia? Absolutely. I don't think it's quite there yet, though. It's moving in that direction, but it really is. China has yet to really clear its field, so to speak. Like some of the stronger countries in Asia, they have a lot of potential too.
That's very interesting because I think many people have sort of a general perspective when we speak about hegemony. But when you said those facts and comparisons, I was thinking, are there more hegemonies in the world? Economic hegemony, maybe military dominance or military hegemony, maybe artificial intelligence hegemony. So I think this is quite interesting. I mean, at the first glance, it looks like a simple topic to speak about. But when you go more deeply into the topic, you realize that there are more to say and more to think about. So, for instance, when you spoke about China, we know that China has Belt and Road Initiative, also military modernization, which is ongoing quite rapidly. Does this not indicate a potential for establishing a new form of hegemony?
It could, absolutely. I think people, especially perhaps modern day Americans, often overstate that the military as the kind of tip of the spear of power, when the interesting thing is that the Chinese are actually looking at American history when they're looking at how to develop. They're looking at how the United States had a kind of more distant, laid back approach, let its enemies fight each other, build up its own industrial base, and then kind of move into the kind of power vacuums that other people leave behind. This used to be the recipe of success for the United States, and the Chinese are actually some of its greatest practitioners today. Kind of famously, many countries that were rivals of the U.S. Used to say stuff before World War II, like, well, they might be able to build all this stuff, but who cares? We spend more on defense and we have more veterans. But the ability to outproduce is actually ultimately more important once you hit the Industrial Revolution and onwards. If your logistics are strong, and you can survive, right? Obviously, morale is important too. You can be a superpower and still lose in, Vietnam. That's arguably both the US and China have. And, these things can happen, but if you're really on the line, if you feel something is existential, you'll be able to absorb losses, learn, and become better if you have a superior logistical network, if you have the superior ability to kind of technologically innovate. And I think the Chinese are following this strategy. But because of that, I don't think that the strategy is necessarily new because, like I said, the US did it before. You could even make a probably more difficult case, but you could make a sort of similar case that the very, very earliest days of the British Empire were similar to this in the sense that like the land-based European countries just fought each other constantly. And Britain was always fighting too, but in this kind of distant, indirect way, and just like taking their colonies here and there, and not like dumping hundreds of thousands of men onto the continent if they didn't have to. So, this kind of stay back, wait and see, soft power can kind of work as long as it's tied to material industrial facilities. I think soft power also by modern Americans can be terribly overrated too in the cultural sense because people will just throw that out the window once there's a crisis. But in a material sense, it's a very, very real thing. And so, yeah, we're seeing something I wouldn't say is new, but the methods that it expresses itself could be new. So if China is really pushing ahead with like fusion power, if it's really, shall we say, democratizing AI usage around the world, these could be incredibly impactful things for China going forward. But future forecasting on this kind of stuff is difficult because you never know what's going to be kind of a dead end and what isn't. You never know what could be, now everything is pioneered in China. Well, maybe 5 years from now, it's another country that will be doing it. Who knows? But it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible that we could see a kind of new technological thing. And we could also see this expressed in a non-state way, which can be also kind of disturbing, frankly, because we see this push with this kind of what I call like techno feudalism, right? Where there are these companies that are following certain paths and they have like very specific company cultures, and they're international companies, but they're very much trying to, or I don't know if trying is the right word, but the effect of what a lot of what they do is that they have these kind of like fiefdoms, right? And then their customers are kind of connected to them, and it may be an international network, but it is still very much a web of hierarchies, not dissimilar to a kind of weird feudal arrangement. So we have that going on. I kind of think in the end, large countries anyway will have the kind of gravity pull of their defense establishment is going to recapture these organizations and kind of force them to orbit. I guess I'm really into astronomy analogies these days, but to orbit their security concerns first. But there is no guarantee that that will always be the case. It just looks like it is for right now.
Right. I have one interesting question related to what's going to happen. And it's related to sort of material power metrics that we always associate or usually associate hegemony with. So is the decline of traditional hegemony a reflection of systemic changes, or is it merely a cyclical with the potential for new hegemonic orders to emerge, for instance, in forms of digital or financial hegemony / dominance?
Yeah. I would say the only real difference between hegemony and dominance is that dominance is so situational that it could be anything and it could last very, very briefly. It just had to have existed. Whereas like hegemony is actually like a system, right? Like you've been at the top long enough that you've built a kind of architecture to perpetuate the system, which has a kind of weird half-life that can perpetuate itself even after the conditions that created it may no longer apply, albeit not for very long. It's more of a delaying action than a permanent locket, right? So a lot of institutions around the world today set up by the United States primarily, but not exclusively at the end of World War II. They're clearly like under a lot of stress, but they're still being carried forward even while proportional US power is proportionally more declined compared to China in particular. And for all we know, the Chinese might just adopt many of those institutions because they're useful for them. In which case, though, you would see a counterbalancing effort, and the U.S. would actually, might rebel against them more, and so forth and so on. I guess that kind of gets to your other point, though. I mean, I tend to think that politics and technology operate very, very differently from each other. I think that politics is cyclic. It's always been cyclic, and it is not linear or progressive in any way. But technology clearly is a bit more linear. Although, once again, it's dependent on logistics. And if something goes fatally wrong in a logistical network, technology can, in fact, be reversed. There have been times in history where a society's technological literacy has declined. The loss of the canoe and the bow and arrow for Australian Aborigines, or I mean, the quote unquote dark ages in Europe are much overstated, but there was an element of loss of ability for like large scale aqueducts, stuff like that. Lots of people looking at Roman ruins and being like, we walk in the shadow of something that we could not build today, right? And I think we've even seen a little bit of that at the smaller level in developed countries when it comes to kind of deindustrialization and the fact that there's a lot of skills that people used to have that they don't have anymore. But nevertheless, technology, the overall trend is technology does tend to accumulate. In a way, I think that political knowledge and arrangements, it doesn't quite work that way. It doesn't seem like we're just constantly building something better and better. And I think the reason for that is because who holds power is always changing. And my personal, one of my, if not my favorite political philosopher is Ibn Khaldun. And I think, back in the 14th century, he kind of laid it out, right? There's he was going from a material basis of like what resources and land societies have, but he was saying that the ruling elite needs a sense of solidarity. It needs his term was asabiya, but it means like group feeling, togetherness, solidarity, if you will. And they inevitably lose this if they become successful. The more successful society becomes, the more it becomes bureaucratized and kind of everything is kind of less personal relationship and more paid for. That's necessary, by the way. He's not saying that's intrinsically bad. It's an inevitable evolution of a maturing society, but kind of like a maturing person gets more health problems because they're getting older. It solves problems and it creates new problems at the same time. And eventually it's just a bit too abstracted. It loses its solidarity. And then a competing ruling class, whether in his case it was like barbarian nomads outside of the state, but in other societies it's a different thing, right? If you were a leftist, you could say it's like a working class revolution. If you were more like libertarian, maybe you put your faith in tech, whatever. But like some kind of group is coming that then wants to reorient this. And so the struggle for power is always changing people's priorities and switching what power is doing, which is why I think it's much harder to get a progressive political experiment in the long term. But technology goes up. So will this eventually create a tension where the state looks kind of weird and obsolete and it's just doing nothing but providing a Hobbesian security arrangement, and then private enterprise or activist groups or whatever are doing other things. I mean, and they're breaking with it. Well, maybe, but right now, the state still has a monopoly of power, and until that changes, I think the most likely scenario is that the state kind of integrates what it finds useful from these things and then builds off of that to self-perpetuate. Now, eventually this might not work anymore and something else will happen, but under present conditions, it does seem like it's not creating a divide, it's creating a kind of weird merger. But a part of that merger is also opposition. So you see defense establishment kind of grow its ties with tech. That's obvious. But you also see people who are oppositional to whatever government they live in connecting in more ways than one, and oftentimes even internationally connecting, right? The Arab Spring would be a great example of an international event that was obviously fueled by social media in a lot of ways. But in the end, what happened with the Arab Spring too was that those those societies, either the state reasserted control or a new state arose throughout the old elite and then restarted the process effectively. So
There's many news and many articles coming from Russia, China. They argue with multipolarity. The world is changing from certain settings, and they always argue that, oh, the new world order is going to be based on multipolarity. How do you see, or what's your perspective on multipolarity or multipolar world and hegemony? Is hegemony adjusting to this, or is hegemony resisting to that movement?
well, I mean, the short answer, I guess, would be that hegemony at the global level is absolutely resisting it.
Okay.
The problem at the local level, it is not, because at the local level, there multipolarity just means that there are multiple countries who are able to have a kind of dominance over the near abroad, and that is actually perfectly compatible. In fact, part of multipolarity in some ways. Um, Personally, my view, and I was a person who came to international relations through history. So I didn't start in international relations. I was a history first. I just wanted to like work in an archive or teach history, whatever. And I only came to it later. So for me, it always comes to like what proposition has the most examples or counterexamples I can think of, not like what theoretical model I'm trying to fit something in. And for me, I just see multipolarity as normal. I see it as the normal state of human affairs. It has always been the normal state of human affairs at the global level. Certain regions are more prone to having regional hegemonic orders than others. And the effect of this is usually geography. Geography, and it makes it easier, right? So, like, why do, despite the fact that they were both kind of multiple regions of Eurasia were at the technological cutting edge, but why did China have that position more than most in the pre-modern world? And I think it's because the North China Plain made it much easier to have a kind of superstate. It was easier to retain something akin to the Roman Empire in northern and central China than it ever was in Europe, which is much more broken up. And then, of course, Europe's geography is much more maritime focused. You've got just endless peninsulas and harbors and islands that eventually leads it to a shipbuilding technological boom that enables it to overtake most of the rest of the world and then also exploit resources from outside of that. Though this did not, in fact, change the fact that Europe was a multipolar after the end of the Roman Empire. And in fact, you could say that maybe the fact that Europe was so resistant to hegemony helped it develop as well. I mean, Walter Schiedel has a great book on this, Escaping from Rome, and how Rome could have, after a certain time period, could have actually retarded the growth of Europe. And so the Roman Empire lasted too long, in his opinion. I think he makes a compelling case. Whereas there were parts of history where it was good for China that it often had these unified states, though they often split up too. China was often a multipolar system as well, but it was more likely for it to have a unified state. They're called unified dynasties, historically speaking, and that could have come to a point though where it was unified a bit too much, and it could have stifled some degree of innovation. And for me, like the danger of global hegemony is that it could stifle things. I mean, I'm not worried about it now because it frankly doesn't exist anymore. But when I first started thinking about this in the 2000s, I was like, well, I'm a US citizen and this ostensibly benefits me. And it definitely benefits some other countries too. That's undeniable. But it also feels like, what if the end of history is a nightmare, right? What if, what if there isn't if there's a lack of counter models to look at, it's harder to learn from things at the large scale. Now, this is totally misplaced fear because these orders never really last, and the bigger they are, the harder it is to get them to last. But it's nevertheless, I just think that the world is as pushes for disunity as much as it does unity. And so when you see something get a bit too omnipresent, then people are more likely to rebel against it. There's an ebb and flow going on here. That's perpetually in motion, never static. So I just think that it's normal. Multipolarity is normal, but then also, like when you look at these different regions, it's not normal the same everywhere. So you look at this region, and it's like, oh man, no one ever dominates this region, or maybe once in history it happens. And then you look at other regions like Southeast Asia. It's very, very rare for one power to dominate Southeast Asia ever. I think that Southeast Asia should be considered along with like Western Europe as a place where like nationalism as we understand it in the modern sense is actually very normal. So, and then you have individual countries that we now consider as individual countries as a wholly singular thing, often went through large periods of disunity too. Japan would be a great example of this. Huge stretches of Japanese history, it's just like Somali warlord fiefs in the mountains, just going on for generations and generations, and then either coming together very, very loosely. Hence why this is the one country where you get like a really properly developed feudalism outside of Western Europe. Um, and it only really becomes centralized later. But then once it centralizes in the 17th century, it becomes extremely centralized. So there's also the question of time, right? So you're looking at different eras and you're seeing the different regions behave differently. But as time goes on, so too might the regions change. And that I think is the impact of technology. But it also shows that technology is unpredictable. It can create an era where this part of the world is doing really well. Oh my God, progress, right? And at the same time, that era could cause a region that was doing great before to rapidly decline. And then if it's weaker, become exploited by the newcomers, which further exacerbates its decline. This was like the whole like European expansion completely changed the balance of power in world history, kind of on this program. And now we're seeing a kind of inverse of that. That whole North Atlantic domination is rapidly coming to a close. Asia is so much more important. I would argue the Western Hemisphere is also increasingly important outside of the United States in a way that wasn't the case before. Uh, One day we could see very powerful regional states in Africa. It hasn't quite happened yet, but if you go back to the Middle Ages, there certainly were powerful Sahelian empires, various powerful states on the Ethiopian highlands. So, these things, they come and they go. And if you acknowledge that things come and go constantly, it's really hard to put your faith in any kind of unified hegemonic order being a perpetual, super long-term project.
How would you evaluate the US hegemony? Because on one hand, there are articles and books about how this particular hegemony is declining, how the US is losing sort of footprint in many regions. On the other hand, after Trump re-election, we have new policies, we have a new leadership, and Trump is showing that he will be sort of decision maker in terms of how the global order is going to be set up or maybe reconfigured, because he feels that America is the best, the strongest country in the world, and he is the leader of the United States. And suddenly that hegemony has a new dynamics. So this is, I think, quite interesting time and a moment to say a few words about the US hegemony.
It's hard to draw a decisive conclusion there because the Trump administration, as it was the first time around, is so erratic, and it's really hard to see like what the cohesive governing vision is. There are people in the new government who very clearly like are very compatible with a lot of what I say, and they're very much understanding that like the unipolar moment is over, and it's better to preemptively adjust to that before you accidentally find out you try to enforce it and you fail, right? And it's infinitely more expensive and embarrassing to walk into that trap. So they kind of want to preemptively rebalance the posture of the United States. And I think that's a good thing because I think it's just reflective of reality. But there are lots of other people in the administration that don't have that view. It's a real mixed bag. And this is where you get kind of some of the weirder stuff, like the we're going to take over Gaza stuff. And I'm just like, what is that? Especially for someone who, supposedly ran against Middle East entanglement. Like that's like I don't even know what to make of something like that. That's absolutely bizarre. I mean, I'm hoping it's a negotiation tactic to make Gulf states pay for something or whatever. But like, I also know that, despite what he says about wanting to change a lot of old stalwarts in U.S. policy, Trump is very, very incredibly pro-Israel to a point which I think is dangerous for the national interest or for a rational conception of the national interest. So on this particular issue, it's hard to trust him. That being said, who knows? We'll see. um, I've been, it's also weird to say because I've been for years now advocating for the US to prioritize the Western Hemisphere over any other part of the world. And there's a lot of indication that the Trump administration is doing that, but it's doing it in totally not the way that I would have done it, in a way that I actually feel like may long term do a lot of damage. Like the two countries, for instance, I would never tariff would be Canada and Mexico. Never, ever. Like I want those are the two countries I actually think we should be on like permanent good terms with. Um, for our own ease, for our hemisphere security and our own ease of life. But I do understand the desire to dismantle the global free trade network, and in fact, in many cases, I totally support it. There's been it's been a real mixed bag, and it's led to deindustrialization, which is the primary reason that Trump became president. And it's there was a bet that was made in the 80s and 90s that said, and this is why you can't always put your, bet on the linear interpretation of history, right? The bet was, we've only gone so far with industry. We can offshore things now. The future is in services. We don't really need to make anything. We can just like invest stocks and have a service sector economy. And it turned out that was a really bad bet. It's a total dead end. And so the countries that actually have the advantage now are the second tier industrializing countries who are able to say, oh, wait, maybe we want to industrialize, but we don't want to do that. And so we're going to invest in maybe other things. The Chinese emphasis on infrastructure, which if they can't keep going at home, they'll export abroad. I mean, that could be a dead end too, but it's infinitely more constructive in a literal sense. Nevertheless, so you can see, and it imparts a useful set of skills, right? Very few people want to hire internationally, want to hire like US or Western Europe or whatever kind of infrastructure people because they have no experience building in places that don't have pre-existing infrastructure. So like you can if you want to build a place that doesn't have electricity or like a highway system or a railroad, it's going to be infinitely more expensive. They're going to need more experts to come and whatever. Or you could hire the Chinese and they're like, oh yeah, when I was a kid, we came into my home village and I had nothing, and then we built high-speed rail, and then we built a factory, and I've lived through three stages of human development in my single lifetime. And it's like, yeah, who wouldn't take that deal? That's a really good deal. So like, I think the US understands finally, after years and years of people, including myself, but mostly people more impactful than me, saying like this is actually a mistake. Like the global neoliberal experiment is a mistake. You should probably reel back at least some of it if you don't want to hollow yourself out. Now they're moving in that direction. And so was Biden. This isn't just a Trump thing. Trump started some of the kind of rollback reindustrialization policies. Biden expanded them significantly, actually. The weird thing about this new round of tariff threats, though, regardless of if they should or should not be applied to each individual country, the weird thing I find about them is that they're not explicitly paired with reindustrialization. I mean, they could be, but they're not. And that means that they won't really be effective, right? If you just introduce tariffs, which are a tax on foreign goods effectively, and you don't immediately set up the parallel domestic industry in whatever you're putting tariffs on, like it's not actually going to help you. Like the whole reason that in history tariffs worked really well, like they're actually responsible for U.S. development initially in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. They worked because they were explicitly supporting industries at home. But these days, we're not seeing that in many cases. And so I don't think that they'll necessarily work. But we also know that the just complete open free trade thing doesn't necessarily work either. I mean, it works for some people. It works for countries that can exploit certain niches, tax havens, whatever, Swiss banking industry. Well, certain people benefit from this. But like, yeah, you have to be cautious about if you pursue a development path that's just a dead end. And I think there's just more recognition of that, and across the ideological spectrum in developed countries too, which just always makes me wonder, like, why are there these diehard centrists in all these countries that refuse to admit that this is true? Because there is this diehard clique that holds himself up as like super rational about everything, right? And they're always like, actually, no, we can live in the 90s forever if we just will it to be so. And I'm like, but the power is balancing. And the reason it's rebalancing is because of offshoring and like the race to the bottom of international companies trying to look for cheaper and cheaper labor pools. So, it's how are you going to solve that problem? I have no idea. I'm not sure that there is necessarily a way to solve it, but it's interesting to see the US kind of actually for once realizing, oh, we're not just going to pursue this until we're completely hollowed out. Like we are actually going to take some proactive steps, but not all those proactive steps might be good.
Great, so let's step a little bit down or one level down to middle powers. Do you know any good example of middle power with hegemonic ambitions? Or maybe you know about countries, middle powers that are aspiring to become sort of regional hegemon. So what's the situation in this sphere and what's your opinion about the future development?
Yeah, so this is actually, I think, and this is a position common at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. So at IPD a couple of years ago, we released the Middle Powers Project. It's a collaborative work between four authors total, of which I'm one. And we were looking at how middle powers are the most interesting and dynamic part of everything because we just don't see the most likely outcome being a new Cold War between the US and China. We see all these other countries are proportionally much stronger than they used to be. And so that they're just as important to look at as a US China rivalry. And this is very much there's but there isn't one type of middle power, right? And in that report, we talk about status quo versus revisionist middle power. And you have a country like Japan is a middle power. It would be a great power if it wasn't so close to China and Russia is the thing, right? It doesn't quite clear its field. It meets the conditions of great power. And indeed, in the past, it once was a great power. If you just looked at economic data, you would say that is the number three great power in the world. And but its subordinate relationship with the US and its proximity to other powerful countries, it makes this much more debatable. Well, it's right on the edge there. But that's a good example of a status quo middle power. That is, well, when it was a great power, it was the definition of a revisionist power. But these days, it's a status quo middle power. It wants to prevent change from revisionist great powers in particular, and China in particular. It likes its security arrangement with the US, and it kind of likes how things are going. So that might be the top of the middle powers, right? And it's pretty okay. It's not no longer pursuing hegemony. It has a comfortable niche. But also the kind of events that shake history, if you will, probably won't come from there unless something very unexpected occurs, which could always happen. I mean, the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923 or 4 fundamentally changed Japanese politics to a point that changed its behavior on the world stage. So you never know. But we can only talk proportionally about what is, what we can look at as coming trends and not absolute surprises, even if surprises are obviously the more important things when they occur. But yeah, so you see something like Japan, maybe Germany too, the upcoming German elections, who knows? But Germany so far has a history of behaving in a very status quo way. It likes stability. It doesn't want too much revisionism. In its case, Russian revisionism. It's more of its concern. And then you have kind of the more confrontational little powers, right? This would be Turkey is the big one. And that also would be my answer to your question of what's a middle power that's clearly has a hegemonic ambition, right? Turkey is the big one. There's a reason it's the country that I've published a lot on the last couple of years. It's very interesting. It occupies the perfect geographic position for both defense and power projection in its context. It is undeniably a middle power, though, because look how close it is to Russia, and very importantly, for its plans for its own regional hegemony, its proximity to countries that have a similar position to it. Like Turkey might be the strongest country in the Middle East, and I would say it is. but it has not, to keep going back to the term, cleared its field, not remotely. Iran is there. Iran, I think, is weaker than Turkey in many ways, but is still a peer competitor to Turkey. I think there is a plausible near future where Egypt is as well. And then, of course, you have Israel, which is a powerful nation, though I do not believe it has the the kind of weight, the gravitational pull that Iran and Turkey have, because it doesn't have quite that historical kind of civilizational implanted status yet. Nor does it have quite the size, access to population and resources, but it has the best qualitative military, and it has a super strong economy. And of course, as everyone knows, though it's not officially recognized, it has a nuclear arsenal. This is kind of means that things are kind of a bit imbalanced in favor of Israel. A proper balance of power that reflects, I think, like the rootedness of regional powers would drop Israel down a few slots. But as things are right now, there's basically three countries with the potential of a fourth being Egypt. There's three countries that really matter. They're close enough to each other that Turkey cannot, restore the Ottoman Empire informally or what have you. Like it can be the first among equals, which is actually, I think, a regional version of how I view U.S. policy on the global scale. I think the U.S. is still retains the edge in so many ways, except for industrial capacity, which is very important. But right now, it retains an edge. But it's no longer as a hegemon. It's a first among equals, if you will, right? It's ahead, but not in charge. And that's how I would view a country like Turkey, which is Turkey and Iran both are good examples of revisionist powers. It's especially interesting because they're right next to each other. They even have a bit of a border. And so that's, that's a dangerous combination. But it's also an extremely interesting one, because they are both anti-status quo, and they are not quite equally matched, but they are, compatible, or in competition way, if unequally. So to me, that is kind of like, you want to look at revisionist power, look at the Middle East, right? Look at that. You want to see one really trying for it, look at Turkey. Um, Iran, I think, did try for it, and I think it backfired. That doesn't mean it's out of the game at all, but having suffered big defeats in Syria, specifically to Turkey in that case, and partial defeat, at least temporary defeat in Lebanon to Israel, it's looking weaker than ever before, but don't count it out. I mean, Iran was in a much worse position in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. And look where it grew its influence after it was handed Iraq on the silver plate by the U.S. invasion in 2003. So you never know what's going to happen. If you have the ability to sit back, like China does, like the U.S. used to do, like arguably Turkey did at the end of the Cold War, being able to sit back and let other people deal with hard stuff and then come in later and pick up some of the pieces, that's usually the best position to be in. So I wouldn't count Iran out yet, but it is certainly at a low point in the last 20 years of its regional competition.
Chris, you argue that the US foreign policy is driven by misplaced fears. Can you please explain what does it mean and what's the impact on hegemony?
Yeah, in this case, I think this is an illustrative example of why hegemony can be bad for a country, like even the one that has it, where we're used to thinking that it must just be good, at least for the country that has hegemony. But if you have it for a bit too long, you start to believe your own BS, and you start to like forget why you achieved hegemony in the first place. Like usually because you were smart and other people at least were dumber than you, and you were able to do things, you were able to capitalize and learn from their mistakes. And when you have no peer competition for a while, it just becomes, well, this is the natural order of the world. And all we have to do is keep self perpetuating ourselves, if you will. And I think we've seen this, I mean, most recently, consider how much the general public is all of a sudden learning about the spending priorities of USAID or USAID, right? Um, which has been something that I've been aware of, for a long time now, but isn't like something that is publicly discussed about that much because most people just don't know. It's not like it's like super secret. It's just most people don't know and didn't have access to the files to show exactly where the spending goes. But you see this kind of entitled attitude that deep down inside everyone wants. There's a secret American inside of every foreigner that just needs to be brought out, so and then this is kind of tied with this pre-existing belief, which I think is historically false, by the way, of democratic peace theory, where if people share a governing order, especially if it's liberal democracy, they'll never fight each other again. I mean, the communists thought this too, and then the Sino-Soviet split and the Yugoslav, split happened, and it's to me, it's weird. Like there hasn't been enough post-war history to make that claim, especially because no other liberal democracy has been as remotely powerful as the U.S. So, like, why would without that would be the true test, right? It wouldn't be a bunch of smaller countries following the example of like the country that often patrons them. Of course, they're going to look similar. It'd be more interesting if like the Soviet Union and the USSR, the USSR and the US had the same political system in the Cold War. My thesis is that they would still have had the Cold War because it was ultimately about they were threatened by each other more than anyone else. That is the key thing, not ideology. So, they could both be liberal democracies, they could both be communists, it wouldn't matter, would be my contention. But I think that there was a class of people came of age in a world where they never really had to compete for other people's good graces and they never had to sell their case. They just said, like, look, we won. It's the end of history. We're the victors and get on with it. And okay, so there's victor's disease. There's an old proverb by the Chinese strategist Su Shi, which says the time of greatest danger is the time of ultimate victory. And I think that applies here. It's a complacency factor. And then you also are like, oh, why are we spending money on infrastructure? Like what? Why do we have to compete our living standards? It used to be in the Cold War, the U.S. was afraid that the example of the Soviet Union would inspire like the working class to come get them. So it actually helped. I mean, you can debate how much the Soviet Union helped the Soviet working class, but it absolutely helped the American working class because it made people much more amenable to working with unions. It made people much more amenable to social spending. It was like we have to prove that we have a better society than them. And this is an advantage that China has now. China has this advantage of like it's all based on development. It's all based on like increasing our living standards. And that's an inspiring thing that is born of the fact that they were on the down foot for over 100 years. They were everyone's punching bag. And where did that come from too? Let's not forget, the decline of China compared to so much of the rest of the world came in the late Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was so militarily successful because its leadership was actually like Manchus who were like born in the saddle, but like it was so militarily successful at pacifying its near abroad, and it had an initial period of explosive demographic growth and prosperity, and no country nearby was as strong as it. So they were just like, well, why would we ever have to innovate? Why would we ever have to be better? Like we're the best at everything, and that was actually the real beginning of their decline, even before they met the British and had the Opium Wars. So it's a kind of it's hegemony can be very, very dangerous in the long run. You understand why people seek it because it massively increases your security in every conceivable way. It opens up economic opportunities for your companies, for resource access in other societies. I mean, of course, it's logical to seek hegemony, but it causes people to behave illogically if it's too successful. Is the counter, right? And it's really how many societies have ever struck this balance where they've been, oh wow, we're hegemonic, we can't afford to be complacent, we have to keep innovating. I mean, in the long run, it really never happens. You have some societies that can keep it going a bit longer than others, which is fascinating and worth studying. But it is, in the end, it fails, and I think it fails because it has you just if you have no constant challenge to keep on your toes, I just think you become lazy and you just go with the flow. And the flow is just, oh, it's fine. It's fine, everything's working. I don't see any reason to change anything.
Chris, the US has many goals in foreign policy, and some of those goals are related to security issues such as terrorism, international sort of arms trade, and its sort of illegal weapon supplies to different states. So over there, the US foreign policy is dealing with non-state actors. For instance, ISIS, we had Al Qaeda, and we have new entities emerging. So, based on your research, what's the role of those non-state actors and hegemony? What sort of correlations can you see, or maybe asymmetries you can observe?
Yeah, it's interesting because what are these institutions trying to achieve? Now, some of them are just trying to make money, right? So you have like cartels and you have the mafia, and that those are just money making off the books. So that's a bit different. Then you have the very politically motivated uh, non-state actors, of which like jihadists would be one. Um, in the past, it would be international kind of revolutionary type people. Uh, Sometimes, rogue operating international private companies, maybe, depending on your definition. Um, when they're ideologically motivated, I tend to think that their purpose is either to capture a state, to implement their plans, or to eventually, and more likely, to influence the state's policies in their direction, and then they'll disband or become a political party, right? So Sinn Féin would be an example of that in Northern Ireland. In the end, it was perfectly happy getting political concessions and becoming a political party. Then you've got these like hyper Islamist groups. Some of them will integrate into governments. Some of them are really absolutist and they'll either fight forever and lose or take over a state, as they recently did in Syria. And so, but I think the goal is to influence state policy, whether directly or indirectly. And so they are still thinking in a state-focused way. We might come to a point where our, cyberpunk dystopia advances to the point where they won't need a state anymore, and you'll just live in a kind of network. Um, Though I do think that there would still be a geographic basis to this, because in the end, logistics functions through geography. And so, just from a materialist standpoint, even a non-state network that had a lot of power would have some kind of geographical basis, at least a core kind of headquarters region, even if it has very distant satellites. But for now, all we're seeing, I think, is the attempt to integrate with the state one way or the other. So I don't think it's as big of a break as it might first appear.
The last two questions, and they are about your research. The first one is that you mention, or I mentioned basically in the beginning, defense realism. And you seem as a guy who likes realist perspective, and you like working
Yes.
with realist philosophy and assumptions. So why this strand or stream of international relations theory? That's the first question. And then the second question was about the arguments coming from different camps as liberalism, constructivism, maybe green theory of international relations.
Yeah, well, those are good questions. They're also not questions I typically get asked since I left academia, but often got asked in academia. um, so it's good to go back to that. It's been a while. The I would say the reason I picked realism is, well, I mentioned before I started in history and then came to IR later. And when I came to IR, I didn't have a preconceived thing like, oh, I want to be a this thing, And I strongly discourage anyone studying IR from ever thinking that way, by the way. You should absolutely build your worldview off of case studies and the chaotic nature of case studies rather than a supreme archetype of which one tries to follow. Um, and for me, it was just that realism of the political theories had jived the most with the greatest amount of case studies. It just seemed to fit the history that I knew and had been studying more than any other theory. Now, that isn't an absolute claim, however, because I was mostly drawn to state interaction, relations, right? So which I think realism is very good at describing. If I was studying, however, media narratives or how activist networks operate in different countries comparatively, I would not be using realism as my primary thing. So it depends on what you're looking at, right? So they have different focuses. But I do think that the core of international relations is effectively state relations. And I think realism comes the closest of all the mainstream theories in describing that. But even then, though, I wouldn't say realism describes everything. I think that when having a nuanced discussion, it would be wrong to say I'm 100% realist. It would be correct to say I'm 70% realist, 20% world systems theory, and 10% constructivist. uh, but it kind of depends. Like there's multiple forms of realism too, right? So there's classical realism, neo-realism, neoclassical realism, etc. Then you have things that are merger theories with different things. So like English school accept that realism is like mostly historically true, but it could be changed and modified over time. So you have some kind of hybrid stuff like that. I'm a neoclassical realist, and the specific reason that I'm a neoclassical realist is because domestic politics do actually matter, and the other forms of realism are just a bit too flippant with domestic politics. They say it literally doesn't matter, and I think they overstate because of that. They overstate state rationality, whereas neoclassical realism puts domestic politics like very importantly into the mix and says that if it's about regime survival. It's about like getting wins abroad to help you domestically at home is a big part of it. And therefore, you want to self-perpetuate whatever your domestic program is and tie it to your foreign policy. And I think that that's actually mostly true in a lot of history. So there's an interior linkage there, which I think is an important subtlety that neoclassical realism has that makes it intrinsically superior to Mearsheimer's neo-realism, for example, or even classical realism. The classical realism is a bit more nuanced than people think. These days, it's often not nuanced under its modern practitioners, which is a shame. But I mean, like the old school realists, like Thucydides and stuff, um, Chanakya, they all they didn't ignore classical, they didn't ignore domestic politics at all. They saw them as interconnected. And the other reason I guess I'm a realist, because bringing up thinkers from different parts of the world, is that I actually think, despite its well-earned reputation of tribalism, I actually think that realism is the most globally verifiable political theory in a way. Like every single literate culture has a realist thinker, probably more than one. They all exist. Does every literate culture, until very, very recently, have a Marxist or a liberal thinker? No. But this is very like more of a presentist focus, and it's still predominantly Europeans that are buying into that, especially with liberalism. And I guess my other critique would be, I see these things might have a point on these other issues, but kind of related to that prior point, I am philosophically going to prioritize material concerns because once again it's like the logistical thing, right? It's who has the resources and what they are, and I'm going to put those above idealist concerns in most of the time. And so for me, liberalism often just defaults to the idealist worldview, and constructivism, which I think actually can be worth engaging in, especially when you're looking at like propaganda, narrative construction, etc. Very useful. I mean, it's part of my learning repertoire. But constructivism on its own is just purely in this kind of what we would say like Germanic idealist philosophy tradition, right? Where the human mind is creating reality almost through the power of its interpretation rather than being molded by reality in turn. And that's just not a direction I could ever go in. Intellectually speaking, I start with the presumption that nature is real and exists, and we flow from it, not the other way around. So it's just not very compatible on its own, even if it is useful as a subsidiary to different things. But when I was in St. Andrews, I don't know if this is still true, by the way. Maybe you can let me know. But when I was in St. Andrews in the 2010s, constructivism was all the rage. That is a number one predominant theory of it seems like UK IR studies in general, actually. Is that still the case?
It has sort of popularity, but I think they are pretty balanced in all streams or strands of international relations theory. So to say it's dominant, I think that would be overstated. But I think, the popularity, especially among young students, it's certainly there.
Interesting. Sounds like it's actually less popular than when I was there then, because it was very much the default setting,
I see.
which was interesting. I thrive like I said, groupthink is to be avoided, right? So not a problem for me. But yeah, no. But I have a very yeah. I mean, you should learn from all these things. Would be my advice to to students. So it's worth reading all of these things. Also, don't assume that like you're going to learn all of them and then be like, oh, this one's just right all the time. I made up my mind. Like it really depends on what. But in the end, I'm always going to kind of come down to a kind of territoriality rooted in material stuff. I mean, like, and it's not just like even history and IR. I think anthropology kind of backs this up. Like, you have books like The Territorial Imperative, like the one real motivation people have is to have a monopoly over what their sense of territory is. And this goes from the individual with private property to the community and shared property, etc., which of course requires kind of like an other, a foe to function. It's kind of like how we evolved. It's not saying it's good or bad, it just is. And yeah, so for me, like, I don't know, realism has an appeal because paradoxically it is the most globally recognized form of political philosophy. And you can find realists anywhere. But the interesting thing about that is that they're always a little bit different too. So if you read Chanakya and Thucydides and Han Fei right next to each other and Machiavelli, whatever, like yeah, you see what the commonality is, and it's kind of like this moral neutrality and this focus on power makes things right, not morality. But everything else can be actually pretty different, and it's always interesting to see what the differences are, because then you actually do see that there is an element of cultural construction there, and how like history kind of changes people to behave a little bit differently. And I think that's fascinating. Frankly, one day I would love to write a book about it, but we'll see when we get there.
I think a book is a good idea, and I fully support this initiative because I think we need to deal with international relations theory, and we need new ideas, new thoughts, maybe some innovation as well, and how to grab international relations thoughts based on historical perspective as well. Chris, many thanks for your insightful thoughts, for sharing your research outcomes with us. And I wish you good luck and lots of energy to your research, to new publications, and to your all activities that you're doing for international relations. So thank you for being on IR Thinker.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. My pleasure.